know Joan Crawford for being one of the most well-known actresses of the golden era, but what you might not know is before she became an actress, she starred in at least one adult film. The worst part of all of this is Joan might have been underage at the time the video was filmed. Joan was one of the major actresses for MGM at the time, and when the studio heads found out about this possible adult film she had while she was underage, they went at all lengths to make sure this video got destroyed. Allegedly, Eddie Mannix, who was the major fixer of things like this at MGM, partnered with the mob, and they tracked down the people that were going to charge $100,000 for the film to be released. There's actually two different stories of how this came to an end. One being that Eddie offered the extortionists $25,000 for all the negatives, or the mob would take them down and they would get the negatives. And the other one being that he just gave them $100,000 and the tape was destroyed. Crawford was allegedly so thankful that the studio did this for her that when she left the studio in 1943, she wrote them a $50,000 check. Historians believe it was to pay back the studio for what they did. Let's revisit the four husbands of Joan Crawford. Joan was married to the CEO of one of the biggest soft drink companies in the world, and ended up passing away on one of her wedding anniversaries. Joan was married for the first time to the Prince of Hollywood, Douglas Fairbanks Jr. Douglas Fairbanks Jr.'s father was of course the iconic king of Hollywood, Douglas Fairbanks. So this marriage was a huge deal and her in-laws absolutely hated her. Don't you worry, a video is coming. They met when Douglas Fairbanks Jr. was starring in a play at the Belasco Theater in Los Angeles in 1927, and by 1929 they were married. But by 1933 they were divorced after Joan had alleged that he had been unfaithful to her. But come to find out, she was having an ongoing affair with Clark Gable. A video is coming on that as well. She got married for the second time to actor Franchot Tone in 1935. The big drama with this relationship is that Bette Davis was in love with him, but he was in love with Joan, which is what is said to have been the starting point to their infamous feud. They divorced in 1939 after Joan accused him of being physically and mentally abusive. Joan's third marriage was in 1942 to actor Philip Terry. They fell in love after meeting at a dinner party, but were divorced by 1946. He was also said to have been physically and mentally abusive. Which brings us to Joan's fourth and final marriage to the CEO of Pepsi, Alfred Steele. They also met at a dinner party and got married in 1955, and she was with him until he passed away in 1959. She took over for him at Pepsi and never remarried again. I was shocked to find out that they were married on May 10th, 1955, and Joan passed away on May 10th.
Let's spend Christmas with Joan Crawford. In 1949, Joan Crawford sat down with The George Fisher Show to share Christmas with the Crawfords with fans across the country. We see this scene briefly in Mommy Dearest. She sat with her 4 children for the interview in her home in Brentwood on Christmas Eve. Christina was 10, Christopher was 7, and the twins were 3. Joan insists that the children eat breakfast on Christmas morning and says that every other morning of the year they dawdle over their food. She shares that the children get to play with all of their gifts on Christmas Day. Then we put a large group of them aside. From tomorrow on, they earn their gifts. Christopher was still earning gifts from his birthday in October at the time. 3 times a year, Joan would make the kids go through all of their toys and clothes and find things to give away. She says, "I always see to it they give up something they really love." Joan mentions her favorite Christmas song is Silent Night, which honestly tracks for me.
Merry Christmas to you and to all your listeners.
Merry Christmas!
Who inherited Joan Crawford's $2 million estate? She removed her 2 children from the will. Joan Crawford was one of Hollywood's most famous movie stars. Although she had no biological children, she adopted 4. In 1940, she adopted her eldest daughter, Christina. As Christina grew older, she followed in her mother's footsteps and became an actress, starring in soap operas like The Secret Storm. In 1943, Joan adopted her second son, Christopher, and in 1947, she adopted twin daughters, Kathy and Cindy. When Joan Crawford passed away in 1977, she left behind $2 million. In her will, she disinherited Christina and Christopher, leaving the entire estate to the twins and her personal secretary. Christina later wrote in her memoir that Joan was an alcoholic, abusive, and controlling mother. Although the twins denied these allegations, Christopher claimed he did experience his mother's abusive behavior and felt that Joan never really liked them. Some media outlets speculate that Crawford often adopted children during career downturns, raising doubts about whether she did so out of love or to salvage her image. In the end, Christina and Christopher sued and received $27,500 from Joan's estate.
Today's day 8 and we are celebrating the ultimate movie star, Joan Crawford. Lucille Lesueur was a chorus girl on Broadway before she signed a contract with MGM in 1924. She continued to make a name for herself until she was catapulted to stardom in Our Dancing Daughters. By 1931, she was one of MGM's top stars, alongside Norma Shearer and frequent co-star Clark Gable. She appeared in Best Picture winning Grand Hotel. In 1937, Life magazine called her Queen of the Movies. But her popularity began to wane and she was deemed box office poison. She starred in the hit The Women in 1939, but by 1943 left MGM and signed with Warner Brothers. In 1945, she starred in the classic film noir Mildred Pierce, where she would win the Oscar for Best Actress. By the early 60s, she was looking for a comeback hit. She then starred with rival Bette Davis in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. The film was a hit, however, Betty was nominated for Best Actress and Joan was snubbed. But you know Joan wasn't going to let Betty win. She's also known for her relationship with her daughter, who wrote the controversial tell-all, Mommy Dearest. In the 70s, she grew reclusive and died in 1977. Let's celebrate Joan Crawford.
Joan Crawford was born Lucille Lesueur in 1904, 1905, or 1908, depending on who you ask. She attended 2 private schools as a child and worked in order to pay the tuition. She was treated very poorly by the staff and spent most of her time cooking or cleaning instead of learning. Lucille saw dancing as a way to a better life. She entered several contests and eventually ended up on Broadway in the show Innocent Eyes. She started dancing for MGM in 1925. MGM saw her potential to be a star, but supposedly Louis B. Mayer said that her name reminded him of a sewer. The publicity department organized a Name the Star contest, and eventually the name Joan Crawford was born. Her big break came in 1928's Our Dancing Daughters before quickly adjusting to talkies. F. Scott Fitzgerald said she was the best example of a flapper girl. Her persona was born and she was determined to be a star. In 1929, Joan Crawford eloped with Douglas Fairbanks Jr. His father and stepmother were considered to be the king and queen of Hollywood, and Joan was determined to be a part of their circle. Supposedly, Mary Pickford considered Joan to be trash and refused to invite Joan to Pickfair for 8 months after the marriage. Once Joan was able to visit Pickfair on a regular basis, Mary would ignore her when the men went off to play golf. This was all part of Joan's determination to erase her past. She would practice elocution and diction daily to help get rid of her southern accent. In the early 1930s, her career really took off. She starred in 8 films with the king of MGM's box office, Clark Gable. The two began a relationship prior to her divorce from Fairbanks. Her career had ups and downs throughout the 30s, and that's when she decided to take on her most iconic role to date, becoming the real Mommy Dearest. We'll get into that in part 3. As a single woman, Joan Crawford could not adopt a baby in California. This led Joan to adopt Christina Crawford from an illegal baby broker and travel to Nevada to legalize the adoption. Christina famously made lots of claims about her abusive childhood in her book Mommy Dearest, published shortly after Joan's death. It was famously adapted into a film starring Faye Dunaway in 1981. Joan would continue to illegally adopt, using notorious baby snatcher Georgia Tann to acquire her twins. Georgia was a complete monster, but that's not for me to get into. Joan thought that her new image as a mother would help with her label as box office poison. In the early 1940s, Joan left MGM and moved to Warner Brothers. Her Oscar-winning performance as a mother in Mildred Pierce worked as a complete reset on her career. After her release from the studio in 1952, some of her iconic feuds began. We'll cover those in part 4.